So moving into Unit 2, this unit's going to have 3 chapters, Chapter 7, 8, and 9. And a lot of the themes in these chapters are going to sound familiar, again, from biology, but again, we're looking more at the micro side of this. So in Chapter 7, we're going to look at nutrition, ecology, and growth as those things pertain to microorganisms. And so the first thing that we'll look at, and this is your first objective, are the environmental factors that can affect the growth and the functionality of a microbe. And so these 5 factors include temperature, oxygen, pH, osmotic pressure. You also could add in barometric pressure, and then of course there's always just some extra stuff that can be added on to the end. Now when we say that these are factors that can affect microbes, these are also factors that microbes have to be able to adapt to in order to survive. And so what we're going to look through at the beginning of this chapter is talk about the necessities that microbes have, those things that they need as far as nutrition in order to grow, and then we'll move into looking at how these factors kind of will affect that growth. So we talk about nutrition. Be mindful that microbes, especially we talk about bacteria, so prokaryotes, or if we talk about fungi, algae, helminths, eukaryotes, they're all made of cells. Right? And so basic composition of a cell has to do with chanops, if you remember. Those are those common elements that are found in all living things. And so when we look inside of a cell, about 96% of the cell is going to be composed of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and then of course there'll be some extra vitamins or minerals that would also make up that portion of the cell. So when we talk about nutrition and we talk about what microbes need in order to survive, they're definitely going to need large amounts of these elements. Okay, so by definition, nutrition is just the ability of microbes to acquire those elements that they need in order to survive. And so what we do when we talk about nutrition, and some of you may take a nutrition class one day, you'll hear more about this, but what we do with nutrients is we divide them into 2 basic categories. Okay, or subcategories. If we look at objective number 2, this is where it mentions these. And so these 2 subcategories of nutrients are called macronutrients versus micronutrients. Now typically, macro and micro refers to the size of something. Okay, here though, the macro and the micro, it refers to the quantity. So if we say that something is a macronutrient, we're saying that you need larger amounts or larger quantities of these specific things in order to have what you need. And so we think about some of the most common macronutrients. Well, these are going to be a lot of those macromolecules that you talk about in biology. So proteins, carbs, we could even throw in lipids here as very, very important, and so important that you need them in large amounts just to carry out basic cell structures, basic cell functions, cellular metabolism and reactions and things like that. The micronutrients are going to be those that are required just in smaller amounts. So these are still necessities for the cell, but they're not needed in such large amounts because of the roles that they play. So this is going to be a lot of the vitamins, the minerals, so we think like zinc, nickel, manganese, those that act in enzyme function, maintaining protein structure, but again, those that are not needed in such large amounts. Now, one of the things that we want to talk about when we move into objective number 3 is that as far as microbes are concerned, and really as far as cells are concerned in general, they're going to need carbon and they're going to need energy. Okay, so carbon, one of those basic macromolecules that's needed, and so with carbon, you're looking at 2 ways that a organism would obtain carbon. And you probably have heard of these words before, just maybe not realize that when you use the words, you're describing their ability to get carbon. And so if we look at a heterotroph, so the word hetero actually means others. So heterotrophs are what we call other feeders. And so the way that a heterotroph gets carbon is from other organisms. They're going to consume other living things. Autotrophs, on the other hand, auto means self. So autotrophs, they're self-feeders. They don't actually consume other organisms in order to get their carbon. Instead, they use carbon dioxide that's found in the atmosphere. So they just absorb the carbon that's around them and use that as their carbon source. Now, we also note that organisms, especially microbes, are going to need energy. And so two major ways that these microbes will acquire energy. One way is called a chemotroph. And so if they're chemotrophs, they gain energy from chemicals, which means typically other living things. And then phototrophs, obviously the photo means light, so they're going to gain their energy from sunlight. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of skip forward to is just to show you that you can actually combine these words that we talked about, the photo and the chemo, you can combine with hetero and autotroph. And so when you look at this one, like a photoautotroph, well, they're going to get their energy from the sun. They're going to get their carbon from atmospheric carbon dioxide. Right? Or you look at a chemoheterotroph, they're going to get their energy from the sun, they're going to get their carbon, or they're going to get their energy from other living things, and the hetero, they're going to get their carbon from other living things. So these words can kind of be combined to describe how they get both their energy and their carbon. Now, if we look at object number 3, again, it goes into more detail into these words, and so again, just repetition. So that heterotroph describes how they're going to get their carbon. It's from others, so eating other living things. Autotroph, going to come from atmospheric carbon dioxide. And then we did just want to remind you that a large portion of our microbes are saprobes. Bacteria and fungi are the main decomposers, and so they are definitely going to be others feeders. They're definitely going to be heterotrophs feeding off specifically off of dead material. Okay, and just a quick question for you to go and read through, and then there's your answer. Now, coming back to this original list, so we know what microbes need. We know the nutritional requirements they have, and so let's look at some factors that affect them. Okay, we're going to start with the first one on the list, which is temperature. Okay, so when we look at temperature, there are basically ranges that we kind of look at in describing temperature. So what you'll usually find out about a microbe, like if they ship us a microbe from the lab, they'll tell us a minimum temperature, a maximum temperature, and an optimum temperature. So you think about minimum. A minimum temperature would tell us, okay, this is the lowest temperature that you could put them in where they would actually continue to grow. In other words, anything lower than this, more than likely, is going to kill that organism. Maximum temperature would obviously then tell you the highest temperature that they would still grow. Anything higher than that, again, would typically kill them. And then they also typically give you what we call the optimum or optimal temperature, and that optimum, it means the perfect one. It means if you store them or place them in this particular temperature, it's going to promote their fastest rate of growth, and so they're going to reproduce as rapidly as possible. So for all microbes, they're going to have all three of these ranges. They're going to have that minimum temperature, the lowest, the maximum, which is the highest, and then that perfect optimum temperature that's in the center. Now, as far as the way that microbes have adapted to temperatures, we have three basic groups of microbes in regards to temperature. So we have what are called the psychrophiles, the mesophiles, and the thermophiles. Well, if you look at the psychrophiles, they prefer below 15 degrees. So if you think about what 15 degrees feels like, well, that's cold. Okay? So these are microbes that actually can grow in your refrigerator, in your freezers. Okay, so Staph aureus listeria, and that's an interesting concept because a lot of people think you put it in the fridge, you put it in the freezer, and it kills it. But these guys actually prefer cold temperatures. Some of these can actually grow in the snow. Mesophiles, these are going to be the ones in the middle, 20 to 40 degrees Celsius, specifically 37 degrees Celsius, which is optimal for them. These are human pathogens, and pretty much everything we're going to grow in class are going to fall into this category. You also have the thermophiles. They're the ones that prefer above 45 degrees Celsius. They like it really, really hot. And so only a small category can actually fall into this category because it is so extremely hot. But temperature is not the only factor that can affect the growth of a microbe. Gas can also affect it. So we think about gas, the most common ones we look at are like oxygen, carbon dioxide. And so one of the things that I did want to mention is that if a microbe is going to use oxygen as a source, they have to have enzymes in order to utilize it. And so the enzymes that are listed here, superoxide dismutase, catalase, again, you know they're enzymes because they end in ASE. So again, if they're going to use oxygen, they have to have these enzymes to help to keep that oxygen from becoming dangerous to them. If they don't have these enzymes, then typically they can't use oxygen. So we have a couple of words to describe microbes as far as gases are concerned. If they utilize oxygen, meaning if they possess those enzymes and they can use oxygen, we call them an aerobe. And so a couple of different varieties of aerobes. You have obligate aerobes. Obligate means they have to have oxygen. Facultative means they can have it or they can't. They're fine either way. Micro, they're going to use oxygen but only in small amounts. If you know what an aerobe is, then you also know what an anaerobe is. An in front of a word means without. So anaerobes, they do not use oxygen. If they're obligate anaerobes, they absolutely cannot be in an oxygen environment. They'll die. Aerotolerant anaerobes, these are those that they don't really use oxygen, but they can be in an environment where it's present and it does not kill them. And then they just mentioned as far as carbon dioxide is concerned, that's also another gas that can affect them. They mentioned capnophiles that actually prefer higher concentrations of carbon dioxide than would actually be present in the atmosphere. So that's a category of microbes. So we know that temperature affects them. We know that gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide affect them. We also know that pH can affect them. And so when we talk about pH, obviously we're talking about acid versus base here. And so most microbes are going to be found in the category of neutrophiles, which means they prefer pretty close to neutral. If you remember, the pH scale goes 0 to 14, right? So anything below 7 is an acid, above 7 is a base, at 7 is neutral. Most microbes are going to prefer a pH of 6 to 8, which means pretty close to neutral, maybe slightly acidic, slightly basic, but nothing too strong. Now, there are also those that actually fall, though, under the category of acidophiles. Acidophiles prefer strong acid. These can grow in an environment that has a pH below 6. So these would be microbes that actually could grow like in your stomach, in your digestive tract, which actually has a high acid content. There's also those that are called alkalinophiles, meaning they're alkalines, or they prefer that basic environment, which is anything above 8. But again, majority of microbes going to fall in that category of neutrophile. We also know that osmotic pressure can affect microbes, and again, if you think about biology, anytime we mention osmotic pressure or osmosis, we're talking about water, specifically the movement of water. If you remember, water tends to move from a higher concentration towards a lower concentration, and so we throw out words like hypotonic, hypertonic, right? And so if an organism is placed in an environment where there's a lot of water around them, they're going to take on too much water. Could cause them to swell, could cause them to burst. Or the opposite of that. If they're found in an environment where there's not much water, they could lose water to the environment and actually shrink, potentially collapse. So it mentions there are some that have adapted to those kind of conditions. Osmophiles, they actually require a high salt environment. You can also call them a halophile, meaning they can live in less water, more salt. Or osmotolerant, they don't require higher concentrations of a solute, and they can live in more of a watery environment. So you can see kind of some adaptations with that. We also know that pressure can affect them. Some can survive in extreme pressure, some cannot, which is why things like the autoclave, pressure cookers, kill most microbes because they can't survive in high pressure situations. Although, of course, there are always a couple of exceptions to the rule.